Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on wildfires, utilities, prevention, and power shutdowns, and how to deal with the aftermath of the wildfires that we've seen, most recently, of course, devastating Southern California. So clearly a very timely topic, and we have an outstanding panel to discuss this issue, very knowledgeable, and will be able to discuss all the issues associated with it. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank all of our partners for their support, and in particular, our co-host, the Edison Electric Institute, the Smart Electric Power Alliance. We are very grateful for all of our partners and their support, which allow us to bring this information and material to you. I also want to point out that at the back end of the hour, we'll be taking your questions. So please submit them in the in the tab that allows you to do that, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. I also want to recommend to all of you that one of our energy policy's major programs, which is our resource library, will have materials, articles, papers, reports, et cetera, specifically on this topic. So for all of you who are particularly interested in this issue, there is additional content that you can enjoy in the resource library on the Our Energy Policy website. So I don't want to take up any more time because this is a fascinating topic, and I'm sure it's going to be a very insightful conversation, and we're going to get to it now. We're really fortunate to have as our moderator one of the top energy reporters on electricity, power grids, and the entire electric grid, and that is Catherine Morehouse from Politico. Catherine's been an energy reporter for Politico now in her fourth year, was at Utility Dive before that, an award-winning journalist, and we're delighted to have Catherine moderate this discussion. So Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was a really nice introduction, so I appreciate it. And like you said, this is a really knowledgeable panel here to discuss a very critical and timely topic. So I'm so excited to be here with these folks, and I'll go ahead and introduce them now. First up, we have Emily Sanford Fisher, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Before that, spent a long time at the Edison Electric Institute. Joe Wilson is Regional Vice President for Pacific Gas and Electric in the North Valley and Sierra region, and he has spent over 2 decades in the utility space. And then Eric Gray is Vice President of Government Relations for the Edison Electric Institute, the trade organization for investor-owned utilities across the country. So we have a lot of EEI and utility brainpower here today, which is great and appropriate for the topic. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks. So first of all, I want to just to kind of lay the groundwork. I want to get a sense of what wildfire risks look like from the utility perspective from the start of some of these events. So maybe, Joe, this is an appropriate first question for you. Can you talk through how utilities track and model the potential risks of wildfire ignition from power lines during both normal events and high wind events? What does that look like? What does that process look like?
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. Great to be here. So what we use is a probabilistic risk model. And what that does is it incorporates all sorts of factors such as weather conditions, vegetation density, fuel moisture, and historical fire data to predict the likelihood of ignition. So when you stack all of those models together, it gives us a pretty good indication of what fuel and fire conditions are. We also have deployed weather stations throughout the PG&E service area to give us that intel that will help us to, again, more narrowly focus what our predictive models are. And then we have weather stations, cameras, and all of that kind of stacks into a fire potential index. And we use a model that goes from R1, which is lowest, to R5 plus, which is highest risk. And it takes all of those factors into account and helps us to make some risk-based decisions about really how best to mitigate wildfire risk, especially during some of the highest risk and highest wind events.
Great, thanks, Joe. And, obviously there was recently the devastating wildfire in Los Angeles, a big reason why we're here today. And there just has been overall a dramatic increase in wildfires over the years, in large part because of external factors like climate change, drying vegetation, development in different places. So how has the utility approach changed over the years that you all have been in this business? What are the lessons that have been learned as these risk factors keep increasing, and how is that shaping future strategies for prevention and management?
Well,
Go ahead, Eric. You can
no.
jump in and I'll follow up.
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, thank you, Catherine, and thank you to Our Energy Policy. I do want to take a minute just because you referenced the California, fires, and just big thank you to the first responders and all the folks too. Our hearts go out to you that are dealing with this. It's truly, tragic scenario and just really, catastrophic events. So really just big thank you to the first responders and a lot of our member company crews that are trying to restore power during all of this. So with that aside, though, as we're looking at this as an industry, I think what has changed is, I think when it comes to wildfires, it's always been viewed as a Western issue. And I think that's what really has changed in our sector, and especially with EEI member companies, is this issue, these frequencies of these catastrophic events are only increasing and also are moving more and more east. So I think you're seeing, as an industry, we are having more and more conversations looking at this as an industry as a whole. And I think what we're asking for policymakers here in DC and honestly across all the states is a holistic approach, that we need to really look at many different solutions, because at the end of the day, there's not a silver bullet that's going to fix everything. Joe talked about a lot of the technologies and the modeling and the things that his company's installing. A lot of our companies are looking at that, but that's going to be a little bit different from a risk portfolio for his company compared to somebody in the upper Northwest or the upper Midwest, or even in the Southeast. We saw fires in Louisiana. So I think as our when you're asking about the approach, it's just changed that all of our member companies are looking at this issue now, not just those in the West.
Yeah. I wanted to maybe connect a couple of dots between what Joe and what Eric said. Joe, I think he would say, unfortunately, has had to become really in tune with some of those models and indicators for high fire risk weather, particularly around wind and dry vegetation, for the reasons that Eric pointed out. Was for a while, it looked like this was a California problem, right? There were some really big fires at the end of, 17, 18, 19 in California. And so the California utilities have really taken great strides to be better informed about what could lead to a fire so that they can reduce the risk that their equipment might be involved. To Eric's point, it has been increasingly clear over the last couple of years that this is not a California problem. I think a really big wake-up call for a lot of folks was the Lahaina fires in Maui. I mean, in the abstract, if you tell someone that there was a wildfire in Hawaii, they'd say, what? Like, that's not the mental image we have of Hawaii and its topography and its climate. But it actually is an area that, as a result of some of the factors that you pointed out, Catherine, changing climates, changing weather patterns, changing rain patterns, but also land use issues, is more at risk for fire. And we're seeing that sort of across the West, and as Eric pointed out, moving into the East. So a lot of utilities are trying to learn from Joe and some of his colleagues across California and some of the other Western utilities. How do you put in place those programs so that you have better situational awareness? And to Eric's point, the risks are going to be different in different states, just because, Joe's topography, the mountainous, dry areas in Northern California, is a really different set of risk factors than maybe like brush in like Arizona and New Mexico, right? But we all need better situational awareness. We need to deploy the tools that are appropriate for the particular utility's risk profile so they can stay ahead of this. And it's one, understanding what's coming, but then two, being able to make smart investment decisions to mitigate that risk, right? And so the whole industry is involved in this sort of process of learning how to assess risk. I don't think most utilities now are hiring meteorologists and other folks who have expertise in these areas. I have a senior in high school, and I keep saying, are you sure you don't want to be a meteorologist? Because it seems like that's a growth industry. So that we can have better awareness within the companies of what's going on. Not to make light of a really serious situation, but like, these are things that we have to plan for, and they're not inexpensive. But, I think we'll probably get into this. There are things outside of the utilities control, weather and climate is certainly one of them. The other one is that land use issue, right? We have decades of mismanagement of federal lands, in particular forests, and not being able to also address grassland issues. It's very difficult for utilities to access their rights of way that go through federal land so they can do appropriate mitigation, right? So we're living with the consequences of some long-term decisions there. And it's just really un-American to tell people they can't live where they want to live. But we have allowed development in the wildland urban interface, which is a high risk area for fires. And so when there are fires, they are much more destructive because there are more people and more buildings in those places. And so it is really a confluence of factors. Utilities can take great strides to understand the situation and to be prepared and to reduce risk. But there are just other factors that we also need to address as we think about this problem and how to solve it, as Eric said, holistically.
Thanks,
Really
Emily.
well
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I was just going to say, we've taken an approach where we have basically stacked layers of protection. So you need all the tools in the toolbox to be able to effectively mitigate wildfire. We've taken inspection information about our assets, tree proximity. We've looked at situational intelligence from the weather stations and the cameras. And then we have operational mitigations such as enhanced power line safety settings that will shut off a power line within 1/10 of a second if it detects a fault, down conductor detection, vegetation management, and then PSPS if needed. And then on top of that, you put in hardened infrastructure, whether it's overhead hardened lines or underground lines, and you stack all those things together, and we've been able to mitigate risk from our assets by 90%. But it takes all of the tools in the toolbox to be able to effectively mitigate it.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, and I definitely want to follow up on a couple of things Emily said later about just broader improvements that possibly need to be made. But one thing I want to follow up on for now in particular is the cost of some of these mitigation efforts. Obviously, these solutions, some of them are expensive, some cost different amounts than others, unsurprisingly. But maybe Joe, from your perspective, since again you've been very much on the front lines of this, how is PG&E balance the need for these long-term investments in wildfire mitigation with the need to maintain affordability for customers? And then maybe Eric and Emily, you could speak to how that is starting to impact other utilities who, like you said, haven't actually had to deal with, investing in wildfire mitigation in the past.
Well, we use our risk model to make sure that we are investing dollars, our customers' hard-earned dollars, into the areas that are going to make the biggest difference first. But something that's, I think, underappreciated is the impact that a long-term capital investment in hardening the system can make versus the short-term mitigations of cutting trees or doing veg management. It costs customers on average about $1 a month to basically underground lines versus $20 per month to do routine veg management. So I think taking the long-term approach is the best is best for our customers. And one of the things that's underappreciated is when you make investments in the utility system, harden lines or underground them, you increase reliability as well, which is good for customers.
Yeah, and maybe Eric and Emily, you could speak to what that's looked like for, again, these utilities who you mentioned that haven't had to deal with wildfire mitigation in the past or haven't thought of themselves as part of that bucket. How has that looked to them from a regulatory perspective to all of a sudden be thinking about those kinds of mitigation strategies?
Emily, do you want to go first this time and I'll feed?
Sure. Eric and I worked together for too long. We probably have the same thoughts.
We can finish sentences if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think, a really interesting aspect of this is that a lot of these investment decisions are going to be made by state regulators, right? Who have a charge of being very concerned about cost to customers. And I think to Joe's point, you have to be very cautious about investing the hard-earned money of people who are paying electricity bills, particularly as electricity prices are going up as a result of inflation and a lot of other factors. And so I think a conundrum we have is that proactive investments to reduce risk feel really hard for commissions to wrap their brains around, because you are talking about potentially expenditures of a lot of cash to avoid disaster. And the way that you know that you've been successful is that there was no disaster, right? And so that's really hard for regulators to wrap their brains around. And so unfortunately, you tend to see commissions being more willing to authorize investments after there has been a fire. And so that's really a place where like conversations like these are so important, because educating people about the fact that we can reduce risk, we can, reduce damage, we can save lives if we make proactive long-term investments, is really critical, so that regulators can sort of put this all in context. But even in states like Joe's, where they know firsthand what happens when you don't invest to reduce risk, they still sometimes don't say yes to everything that Joe thinks is necessary to reduce risk. And so we're going to live in a world where we're probably not going to make as many of the investments as we need to, as fast as we need to, because we're trying to balance a bunch of considerations, including costs. But I think helping regulators think about the long-term benefits of not having fire. And there are some other benefits that some of the technologies that Joe mentioned have, in terms of like providing greater system resilience, just generally speaking. Like veg management is important no matter what. It can also help us integrate, distributed energy resources more efficiently. We need to make a broader case for these investments so that we can make them.
And I think I would add in with what Emily said, as an industry, our kind of core focus really stems on reliability and affordability when it comes to the grid and for our customers, or for our member companies' customers. I think what has, changed, especially for, and it's the California members as well, like Joe's company, you're not only educating the regulator, but you're educating the customer as well, of why these investments are needed, why we are moving forward with whether it's vegetation management or asks surrounding new technologies and things like that. It is a broad-based education effort to bring everybody up to speed. But I mean, wildfires have been around for a while, but they're growing in size and intensity. So, many of our member companies are having those increased conversations, kind of two-pronged, both from a regulatory perspective, but then just a broader, discussion with their customers of why these resilience investments are needed and why they're needed now to prevent further issues in the future.
And Catherine, if I could add one quick thing, the sort of other side to this coin is that the utility industry is the most capital intensive industry in the United States. We're talking about, munis, co-ops, and IOUs altogether raising more than $150 billion annually to invest in the generation, transmission, and distribution system that basically underpins our entire economy, right? And one of the consequences of wildfires is the liability that utilities face as a result of their potential involvement in the ignition of a fire. And that is having pretty significant impacts on companies' ability to raise that capital at affordable rates. Like, it's having pretty significant impacts on our ability to raise debt and equity. And it's also, so people are seeing downgrades to their credit ratings, and it's also depressing utility share prices, right? When you're in an investor-owned posture. And that actually makes it more expensive to make these investments, because that cost of capital increase gets passed on to the customers also. And so it's sort of it's really important to make these investments to reduce risk. And then it's really important to make these investments so that we can make these investments, right? So that we can keep investing in the grid so it's resilient, clean, and reliable. And so it's a pretty thorny challenge, but these investments to reduce risk are pretty central to like solving the problem.
Yeah. And I want to ask about, given that those risks and the fact that, there's only so much customer money that utilities can spend and only so much regulators will really approve. What options are there for outside of the utility space? What more needs to be done to mitigate these risks? Because obviously that's a pretty big burden on that sector. And yeah, are there things that need to happen at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level to reduce those risks further and frankly prevent having to spend that much and having to have those conversations with regulators and having to raise customer bills?
100%, and maybe I'll jump in first here. And Catherine, that's the conversation, EEI and our member companies right now, we've been having well over a year with lawmakers up on Capitol Hill, with folks within the administration, especially, from the regulatory perspective. There are things they can do that help tenfold when it comes to prevention and mitigation. Simple things like expediting permitting so that, like Joe's company can go into their rights of ways and do vegetation management and do it in a timely manner. Some of that bureaucratic, kind of red tape, just cleaning that up, because, doing simple things like that, just simple vegetation management, can help, reduce the risk of a fire being catastrophic versus not catastrophic. I don't know how we rate fires, but basic things like that, as far as vegetation management, can be huge. And we're also trying to have conversations with lawmakers too when it comes to FEMA aid, things revolving around strict liability. Emily mentioned a lot about liability reforms. Again, gets to my very earlier comment of, we really need to look at this as a holistic approach. We can have as many conversations as we can with regulators and the necessary investments we need to make. But again, I think this is a federal down to the local level of a bigger conversation we need to have as a country.
Yeah, just piling on to what Eric mentioned, this is a societal problem. This is not just a utility issue. Wildfires are affecting more and more of our citizens. And I mean, there needs to be smart policy decisions made on land management, on defensible space, forest management. So it really is part of a larger discussion. And I think that a lot of investments, unfortunately, are made after a wildfire has already happened. There's a lot of investment in suppression. There needs to be more investment in prevention.
And have you seen any changes at the regulatory level, or shifts where regulators are maybe starting to understand that more, or are feeling the need to advocate at the state level or at the federal level and say and kind of talk about the pressures that they're under and the balance that they're trying to make? Obviously, you're not regulators, but I know you talk with them a lot. So curious if you're seeing any shifts there.
I can start off here. The end of last year, the National Association for Regulated Utility Commissioners had a pretty intensive series of discussions with commissioners about how state regulators should be thinking about and approaching these issues. It was a very robust educational effort that also got into what is the role of state commissions in this effort to try to both help utilities reduce risk, but then also help them manage the costs and the potential liabilities. So, and you've seen some individual states take some actions. Joe would be way more qualified than I am to talk about some of the things that California has put in place to support wildfire risk mitigation at the utility level. So I'll defer to him on that. But you've seen states like Washington, have a legislative mandate for wildfire mitigation plans for their utilities, and for them to go about sort of creating a template plan for their utilities in the state to use. You see a lot of other states opening up dockets to start collecting information about what risks are in their state and what mitigations might be appropriate from those utilities. And I think those are really important first steps. On the liability side, you've seen a couple of states think about whether or not you need to limit liability for utilities. So what tends to happen is that if a utility is involved in a fire, they end up strictly liable for all of the damages that flow from that, which means it's not really an assessment of whether or not they operated their systems appropriately or they were prudent. They're just, if there's damage, the utility's liable. And that's what a strict liability regime means. And, you kind of understand how we've evolved this way, legally speaking, because most people who lose everything in a fire are chronically underinsured. And so courts are just looking for somebody to help these people out. And the people that they usually look to are the utilities, right? But those massive liabilities have really significant implications for the financial health and well-being of those companies. I talked about their ability to raise capital. Joe's company went bankrupt as a result of this. That's not great for the provision of affordable, reliable service in America. And so you are seeing some states like the state of Utah actually limit some of the damages that can be awarded, particularly those related to pain and suffering, like emotional, non-economic damages. And we're asking the utilities to essentially serve as the insurers of last resort for a lot of property owners, and that's probably not a sustainable system. So it's important that states and maybe even the federal government explore what role they could play in helping people be better insured and recover from fires, and how to support utilities that face, liabilities to help people who have been harmed.
And Catherine, maybe I can add some points in here too, and completely agree everything that Emily said. But going going back to the change in the regulator or change in the lawmaker, I think everybody had a knowledge base of wildfires, but I don't think they really had a knowledge base of the impact to the industry. And I think we as an industry have done a really good job, but we're just going to keep continuing to do the education aspects of this, but really walking lawmakers and regulators through the true impact to really get to what Emily talked about, the potential liability risks that our companies are facing of being essentially that insurer of last resort, and what that means to capital investments that we can make as an industry in the prevention measures that Joe kind of walked through that we're trying to achieve, and just investments in general to meet increased power demand and all the other things that we're facing in the industry right now. But I will say it has changed. I do think there is a better understanding of the impacts to the industry. Now it's just trying to get them to react to it and start moving forward, and going beyond of just, hey, we'll throw a little funding here to help with X, Y, and Z. Now we're really asking them to roll up their sleeves, start looking at expedited permitting, the cleaning up of things like FLIPMA when it comes to strict liability. Emily's smiling because I'm doing my inner attorney right now, even though I'm not one. Just play one on TV or webinars. But discussions around emergency support and things like that. So I do think the conversation has changed, and a lot of that is just the education aspects.
Yeah, and on the insurance point, have you seen any changes within the insurance industry specifically, or with insurance companies that has impacted how utilities are making investment decisions? I know you've talked about how these investment decisions have been made more complicated, but I guess can you get more specific about what kinds of changes you're seeing within the insurance industry in response to wildfires and how that's impacted your decisions or utilities decisions?
I feel like this is a good place for Joe to start, but then I have some thoughts.
Sounds good. So yeah, insurance companies have seen the increasing risk, and they of course have increased the cost for liability insurance. A few years ago, it cost PG&E upwards of $600 million for $1 billion in annual insurance. So what we've done is we've had to retain more risk, and we've started to self-insure. We worked with our regulators and moved 2 years ago to 100% self-insurance framework, and it's really been successful. We have confidence in it because of all the mitigation factors that we've been able to put into place. And the bottom line is it's going to save our customers $1.8 billion over the space of 4 years. So as insurers have kind of backed away from the risk of wildfire from utility wildfire risk, the utilities have had to step up and manage that risk on their own.
And I'll say that, Joe and his company are finding paths forward. They're a big company, but he just told you that he retains about $1 billion of liability that they're going to self-fund potentially. And that's true for a lot of the California companies. Smaller companies might not have the financial wherewithal to do that. And so insurance markets for utilities are tightening just across the board. Utilities also use a lot of mutual insurance, and those also don't have a lot of capacity. So the industry is used to layering insurance, and our options for layers are getting smaller. On the homeowner side, you're seeing insurers retreat from the market. And that I think compounds some of the challenges that homeowners face if they are in a high risk area. They can't get insurance at all, right? And that's not good for customers. And that seems like a problem that needs solving. You've definitely seen federal government and state governments step in the past when sort of like weather events have made it impossible for people to get appropriate levels of insurance. Not everyone loves the National Flood Insurance Program. It has some challenges, but it exists for exactly the same reason. People were unable to get appropriate amounts of insurance. And that's not good for people when they can't insure themselves. And then, insurance can also be a great tool to have homeowners engage in mitigations that could reduce damages to their homes if they happen to be in an impacted area. And so we're losing a lever to try to reach people to do, some of that like defensible space. There are some relatively simple things that people can do that actually can help their homes survive and minimize losses. But without an insurance industry supporting that, it's really difficult to get people to enact that. So insurance is a big piece of this puzzle.
Thanks, Emily and Joe. I think we have probably time for one more question before the Q&A, and just a quick reminder that we'll do a Q&A at the end. So we have a couple of questions coming in already, but more folks are welcome to weigh in. And I think this question kind of wraps together, what we're talking about with the with the liability factor, as well as what we talked about at the beginning, which is utilities' initial decision making. I mean, how does the utility weigh liability when it's considering making decisions like power safety power shutoffs? Is that public safety power shutoffs? I was like, that can't be right.
Just say PSPS.
Yeah, PSPS. That's what I have written down, and didn't get it right. Yeah, but how does that liability factor weigh in and impact the decision making when you're kind of live and in the moment and experiencing these adverse weather conditions?
I'm happy to really briefly jump off and turn it over to Joe, who actually has to do PSPS. But that strict liability regime that I talked about initially was grounded in California law, some very interesting, unique elements of law in California that had the strict liability regime. But I'd argue that we basically have a strict liability regime across the United States right now if a utility has equipment that's involved in a wildfire because of PSPS. So if the factors and the conditions are such that there could be ignition of a fire and a utility doesn't shut the power off proactively, lawyers will come in after the fact and say that it is the utility's fault for not shutting the power off. And so I think PSPS has become a form of liability. It's essential to not have fires. It's obviously not what utilities want to do. They want to keep the power on, and the impacts of shutting power off are not insignificant. But I think at this point, utilities are looking at a world in which they don't engage in PSPS. They could be facing significant liability.
I would say that we are really focused more on the safety aspect for our customers than liability. I mean, liability is a byproduct if PSPS didn't happen, but our operational decisions in the moment are really focused on what do we have to do to ensure that there isn't a catastrophic fire that starts and really burns through a community. It's the tool of last resort. Our business is about keeping the lights on. So it is kind of contrary to what we are used to when we do shut off power for safety. That said, because we have employed PSPS events, in fact, we've had 3 within the PG&E service territory already this year in the Kern County area, we built this robust system to support customers when they do experience PSPS. Such as community resource centers, lots of communication, backup batteries, generators for some critical facilities. So we're trying to mitigate the impacts of that safety measure that we've taken.
And I would just probably emphasize from an industry perspective, and I'm not an operations person, that Joe's really kind of the expert here, but really what he said about safety, that is the first reaction of all of our member companies is safety, not just of the customers, but also first responders, also our linemen that are out there potentially working on lines, make sure safety is that first thought, and liability is that kind of bifurcated, like next kind of thought post that. But just want to emphasize that point by Joe, because I think every one of our member companies, safety is first and foremost.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that it's time to turn over to the Q&A section for our energy policy. And I believe they're running that part of it. So I will turn it over to them.
Thank you, Catherine. This is Julia with Our Energy Policy, and thank you, panelists, for your time today. We have some questions from the audience. The first one, we have an audience member that is located in a Southern California district that is very prone to wildfires, and they are curious to learn more about the potential or feasibility for utilizing hidden or underground power lines in wildfire-prone areas with existing infrastructure.
Feels like a question for Joe.
Yeah.
So yeah, PG&E has we've made the single largest commitment on undergrounding, I think, in the nation, where we've committed to underground 10,000 miles of electric lines, and it's because we've seen the effectiveness of that. An underground line reduces wildfire risk from electric assets by 99%. It also improves reliability. In my region, I've got about 65% of PG&E's underground work, and we're seeing really, really improved results when it comes to wildfire ignitions. And I mean, just again, reliability has improved. We can't afford not to, and that's the approach that my utility's taken. But we're focusing on the areas that will have the greatest impact. So we're looking at the areas with highest tree density, slope, fire history, really trying to be pretty targeted in where we underground these lines.
Thank you, Joe. And we actually have another question directed for you. For utilities who are facing wildfires as a new risk and are just starting hazard-specific planning, what would you recommend as the best initial steps to begin developing fire preparedness?
Reach out to fellow utilities. That's what PG&E did after some of the catastrophic fires in 2017. We reached out to other utilities that had a more mature wildfire mitigation plan and program. SDG&E had started it, and we adopted a lot of what they had started to employ. So reach out to utilities that have been doing it for a while. We are just ready to file our multi-year wildfire mitigation plan with the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety here in California. I think we learn from each other. This is a space where there's a lot of opportunity for new technology. There's a lot of opportunity for us to share best practices between utilities.
And I can chime in here too, and just from an EEI perspective, because that's been a huge focus for us over the last couple of years, is really, leaning on the expertise that like companies like Joe's or others in California, or just the West in general, as some of our, upper Midwest or Southeast companies, begin to start wrapping their heads around, wildfires and potential impacts, and could they happen here, and what do I need to start, as far as increased conversation with regulators, that sharing of practices is something that we try and foster the most, and lean on the companies that have it there, and even just the technologies and what works, what doesn't, because every region's different, and it's kind of what Emily talked about in the beginning. The topography facing California is very different than some of the fires that happened, like in the Texas Panhandle or Oklahoma Panhandle, where that was more of a grassland fire than an actual fire with trees. So, but
yeah, I'll say EEI ran a really great series of member-focused webinars at the beginning of last year that walk through some of the basics, like how do you do a wildfire risk assessment? What are the elements of a wildfire mitigation plan? What are the key technologies that might map to the risks that you have? And it was really based on sharing information from folks like Joe and others who have been in the forefront of this. I work a lot more with munis and co-ops now. We're running a series of webinars for those folks through SEPA starting later this year for the same reason. The best way to learn about how to go about addressing this problem is from the folks who have been on the front lines. And that's really, I think, one of the hallmarks of the industry is the willingness of companies to share critical information to ensure the safety and the reliability of the system for everybody. So if you're a utility and you're looking for information, Joe and Eric definitely have it for you.
Thank you. And our next question is from someone asking about microgrids. As everyone knows, microgrids have been gaining popularity as a grid management tool to meeting load. And this person wanted you to discuss the use of microgrids near locations with high energy use as a form of grid management that reduces the need for power lines. What are your thoughts on that?
I think microgrids are complementary to this system and not in place of the system. I think microgrids, which to me are just the strategic placement of distributed resources that would allow you to island a part of the grid and run it separately if needed, can be really important in events like PSPS because you might be able to mitigate some of the impacts. But the broader grid provides so much value and is so essential for maintaining reliability and for interconnecting greater amounts of clean energy and just new energy in general, that I don't think it's an either or proposition. But I think the strategic deployment of microgrids could be a way to help mitigate some of the implications of wildfires and in some places potentially to help mitigate some of the risks. But I don't see them as alternatives. I see them as things we have to do in tandem.
I would jump in and say that it's just another tool in the toolkit that many of our member companies can potentially deploy as we look towards, and Joe mentioned some of the newer technologies that we could put on the system, or undergrounding, things like that. It's just another, microgrids could be another opportunity, or another tool that we can use as an industry. But I really want to emphasize what Emily said about the kind of the larger grid. And I can tell you our member companies have built a lot of redundancy into the system to ensure that, just wholesale just can't, go down or whatnot. So over the, last 10 plus years, so much redundancy has been built into the system just for that.
I'll say too, it can be hard to make the economics of microgrids sort of like pencil out if they aren't also part of the broader grid, right? Because a lot of people, in order to make those investments make sense, need to be able to be like selling services or power back to the grid more often than not in order to sort of pay for those investments. So like a community that just has a microgrid has to bear all those costs on their own. And I'll just say SEPA has a case study coming out, not about wildfires, but about a microgrid that Duke had in place that was really beneficial to some of their customers in Western North Carolina after the hurricanes last year. But that microgrid operates in tandem with the system more often than not, and they were just able to use it in this emergency situation to provide power to this town that's at the end of a power line. But the economics of it and the benefits to the customers are really only realized when it's integrated into the system.
Thank you, Emily. Our next question. In Arizona, a bill is making its way through the state legislature that would release investor-owned utilities from liability for wildfires that may have been caused by the utility's infrastructure. What are your thoughts on this proposed bill?
Maybe I'll chime in here real quick, because it gets to, a couple points that I've raised, Emily's raised earlier. I think this legislation goes to that kind of larger conversation we want to have with lawmakers, not just at the state and local level, but also here at the federal level when it comes to liability reforms, and really trying to solve the issue of the industry kind of being seen as that insurer of last resort. And I think, over the years, we've seen plaintiff attorneys really using these events as potential opportunities to recoup a lot more costs than just economic damages. Because when we get into the emotional damages, things like that, that's when a lot of the liabilities really begin to skyrocket. And I think that's what we want to have a bigger conversation on as an industry with policymakers across the country. And I think you're seeing it not just in Arizona. I think you're seeing it in multiple states: Wyoming, Idaho, Utah. The liability reforms were part of AB 10 that was out in California. So that conversation is growing, and I think something that we want to continue to foster in Arizona as well as other states as well.
Yeah. I haven't read that particular piece of legislation, so I won't comment on it specifically. But whenever people ask me about liability and utilities and wildfire, there's always this undercurrent. Is that creating some sort of moral hazard, right? And I'll say that I think the conversation that Joe and Eric were having about what the IOU community is doing is indicative of the fact that they want to reduce risk. And I think there's a way to limit liability, because it probably doesn't make sense to have utilities who can't really, bear risks as an insurer of last resort. That probably doesn't make sense. That's not what the utility model was designed to do, is to deal with those kinds of risks. And I think when people talk about limiting liability, it's usually within the context of what are appropriate ways to ensure that utilities are still moving forward on their mitigation efforts. And I don't think any utility is proposing like, just get me out from under this and I don't have to do anything, right? Like, it's always usually tied to other ways that they're going to continue to demonstrate that they're reducing risk. And that's certainly how the limited liability protections that Joe has in California work. Like, he can only have access to a very large pool of money that might not exist anymore after what happened in LA. If he is making progress toward his annual wildfire mitigation plans. And I think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it.
And I think maybe to give context to when going back literally to the beginning of the conversation, as we're looking the issue of wildfires as a whole, I want to say it's either BLM or Forest Service stat is 90% of wildfires are typically caused by human activities, lightning strikes, everything, where 10% is really focused in on potential utility equipment. So just give a little bit of context of what we've seen over the past when it comes to wildfires.
Yeah, to that point, Eric, there is a lot of inequity when it comes to liability. There are a number of fires in California this last year that were not started by utilities. The Park Fire in my region was started as arson, and unfortunately, it burned over 500 homes. And those customers, those community members, don't have the same recourse as of going after a utility for liability. So I think it needs to be a part of a larger discussion of how do we societally tackle this huge risk.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone. In your lines of work, do you have any success stories for educating regulators or the public about fire risk unrelated to an actual fire event?
I think as an industry, I can say when going back, and I think Catherine had a question on, have we seen both regulators and lawmakers' minds kind of change? And I think the success story there is through education webinars that we've been doing with regulators, Joe's company doing with his state legislators and regulators there. Just kind of the success story is really seeing the education, and I think lawmakers and regulators really having a better understanding of the impact on the industry. Like I talked about, I mean, there was a general sense of, hey, I understand wildfires, I understand dealing with them, but the more that we've been able to work with them and understand the impacts to the industry, I think is a success story of, and really has helped companies like Joe's and others be able to move forward with the investments in resilience, so that, there isn't a silver bullet that's going to stop them, but you can do a lot to prevent them, or prevent them from being catastrophic. So I think that's the goal of the industry, is to continue to build on that success of educating lawmakers and regulators.
I think there's also a recognition on the part of policymakers that conditions are changing and wildfires are becoming more and more extreme. I know this is just an anecdote, but when I was a kid in the early 80s, my dad was a wildland firefighter. And I remember him coming home after 2 weeks fighting a fire, and he said it was the largest fire he'd ever seen, and it was 16,000 acres. And now we are literally seeing fires that are 300, 400, even 1 million acres. So I think policymakers are starting to see that this is not an anomaly. Conditions are getting more and more extreme, and we need to take some action.
Thank you. Now, how effective are or will be advanced weather forecasting tools and AI and machine learning in predicting areas where wildfire mitigation efforts are and will be needed?
It's a critical part of how we build our model. And I am so proud of the meteorology team that we have at PG&E. I think they're some of the smartest people I've ever met. What they have been able to do with their machine learning models is they've been able to more narrowly focus our predictive capabilities down to a kilometer module, or basically a polygon. It is one of the best tools that we have when it comes to building a successful mitigation plan.
Yeah, I'll say that I was fortunate enough last year to visit the new Climate and Wildfire Resilience Center that San Diego Gas and Electric built. They had one of the, I would say, first fires in this like new era of fire back in 2007, and have really made a lot of investments to give them that kind of situational awareness that Joe was talking about over the last almost 20 years. And their modeling tools are bespoke products that they themselves are creating that give them insights into risks. Like Joe, they have weather sensors and wind sensors all over their system, and they are constantly using that data both to talk about what's happening today, but also to feed models to help them make better predictions. And so I think Joe hit the nail on the head. I think these are going to become essential tools that help us, take, gajillions of data points and make more strategic decisions. But, those things take time to build. Joe's company and like San Diego Gas and Electric have invested a lot of money in their ability to do that.
And I also think these technologies are only going to get better. And I think we're seeing more and more technology providers come into the kind of Ethernet of this world. So, I think we view it as the uses of AI and other things. It's only going to help and get better.
Another sort of fun technology option I think a lot of utilities are exploring is, inspecting equipment is a really great way of looking for potential problems on the system. Drones are an amazing way of covering a lot of ground really quickly, and a lot of that are aerial inspections. And so, EEI and others continue to fight for the utility's ability to use drones in that context, but they're just taking a million pictures. And so you're going to need AI to help you sift through that data to determine like where you're seeing potential issues. So there's a lot of technology options, and some of them are hardware and some of them are software.
To that point, Emily, I was talking to one of the leaders of our inspection program yesterday. Last year, PG&E inspected 280,000 structures using drones. We've got over 100 drone pilots that are flying lines right now, and the quality of the photos that they are giving us give us insight into the assets that we didn't previously have. It has been a complete game changer for us.
Thank you. And now, what are the costs associated with grid hardening efforts to mitigate wildfire risks, and how are these costs factored into budgeting for utilities?
Maybe I'll start overarching, and then Joe and Emily can feed in. Emily referenced our industry being the most capital intensive. On an annualized basis, we invest approximately about $150 billion annually. That number I can tell you recently, just due to increased power demand, increased electrification, data centers, AI, we're seeing it actually creep up almost to $200 billion annually. Which just shows the breadth at which our companies are making these investments as a sector to meet this increased demand. And a huge component of that is that kind of resilience investment, the hardening of the system, the necessary T&D to build in those redundancies that I talked about a little bit ago. I think the dollar figures, a couple of years ago might have been 30 billion of that 150 billion, but I think we're only seeing that number increase over time.
Thank you. And now, how are utilities collaborating with local governments, emergency services, and communities to manage wildfire risks?
Well, I can start off. That is a key part of our mitigation plan and the way we work to keep communities safe. We've partnered with local agencies as well as state agencies to pre-position suppression resources. We actually had two of our Black Hawk helicopters lent out to local fire, one in Marin and one in Butte County last year, that allowed those local agencies to more quickly respond to fire starts. Having open communications, we have public safety specialists that we've brought on. We created a unit of ex-fire chiefs, police chiefs, or other high-level personnel from the first responder community, and we've embedded them as agency reps within those entities to speed communication and coordination when we do see fire events or fire potential events.
And I think Joe's example is what you see across the industry. It's not just related to fires; it's all emergency incidents. The community engagement that our member companies have is second to none in the sense of they're working with local lawmakers, local city councils, and all throughout kind of the first responder community. Many times we often call our linemen first responders as well, because they're there too when incidents involving electric equipment and whatnot are involved, whether it's fire or any type of incident. The coordination has always been there.
Thank you, everyone. And now for our last question. How are mitigation efforts impacting rates for ratepayers, And how can we mitigate some of the economic impacts of the increasing expenses associated with hardening our grid against increasing wildfire risks?
I think it's tough to disaggregate wildfire mitigation specific bill impacts, right? To Eric's point, there are a lot of reasons driving increased investment in the transmission and distribution systems and in generation, right? Like there's a need to harden the grid just generally, not just for wildfires, but for other extreme weather events. And meeting new demand has just been a total game changer for the industry, right? And even if you want to meet some of that demand, or you want to minimize spend on the T&D system because you want a more efficient, more flexible distribution system, that also requires investment, right? So there are a lot of things driving investment. So I think it's very hard to like pick that apart. I'll repeat something that I said earlier, which is a lot of these investments can be specific to wildfires, but a lot of them also have broader system benefits. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, and to look at whether or not, like I said, tree trimming is broadly beneficial, even if it also helps mitigate wildfire risk. Some of the more complicated technologies that Joe has talked about, including, increased awareness and ability to control their distribution and transmission system, provides all sorts of benefits to customers, right? Increased resilience, ability to use new technologies, more DERs. And so I think we have to look at it holistically, and it's a broader question about how we manage the impact of all of this investment on customer bills, not just about wildfire investment on bills. And I think that's why you will see some commissions probably pace out some of these investments in some ways. But it's also a really interesting question about how much of this should the customer pay, the person who's paying the electricity bill, versus how much should a taxpayer pay for some of this. This is a societal problem. Some of the causes are not related to things that utilities have any control over. And in general, tax base is a little bit more equitable than the customer base because it's graduated in nature. And so it's really important conversations about, are the right people paying for the right things right now? And are we as a society going to invest in mitigation, which will ultimately, I think, reduce costs for everyone? But rate pressures are a significant issue for utilities across the country, and they're all being very cautious about the investments they make as a result.
So I hate to jump in here now because this conversation, I mean, superb, fascinating, could go on obviously for quite a while, but unfortunately, we promised everyone an hour, so we're going to have to do that. I would just comment that to me, the striking insight that you all provided about the need for regulators, legislators, executive branch officials to understand that this is really a large societal problem that has changed. I mean, Joe, your point about your father and the scale of the fires, and how that has really evolved. I mean, if this isn't on the radar screen of, all of our policymakers who we rely on to, to deal with the challenges like this, it needs to be. And really thank you to all of you for sharing those thoughts with us. And thank you, Catherine, for moderating this discussion. So, my thanks to Emily, to Eric, to Joe, and to Catherine, to SEPA and EEI for co-hosting this, to all of our partners. And mostly our thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us today. And I do want to encourage you, as you continue to work on this issue, please take advantage of our Energy Policies resource library, which has, multiple articles, papers, reports, et cetera, on this topic, and can supplement everything that we heard today. So wish all of you a safe and happy rest of your week. Thanks again to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at an OEP event again soon.